Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for our second Facebook Fridays. So for a while, we're going to try to bring you a new author event every week. Last week, we chatted with Matthew Quirk about his newest book, Hour of the Assassin. And this week, we're really excited to have James Rollins back with us. He was supposed to be at the store
March 27th, I think.
Yeah, so almost a month ago, which doesn't seem possible. We are going to talk about his newest book, The Last Odyssey. It's the newest in the Sigma Force series. And if you order a copy from Murder by the Book, I included the link in the event description. We have these signed book plates that he sent us. We also have these really cool Last Odyssey compasses. So we will include one of those in your order. So just in case you're not familiar with James, he is the author of international thrillers that have been translated into more than 40 languages. His Sigma series has been lauded as one of the top crowd pleasers by the New York Times and one of People magazine's hottest summer reads. In each novel, acclaimed for its originality, Rollins unveils unseen worlds, scientific breakthroughs, and historical secrets, and he does it all at breakneck speed with stunning insight. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Super easy question to start off with. You want to kind of tell us a little bit about The Last Odyssey?
I'm sure. It's a big European adventure. The book travels from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. And since we're all somewhat, homebound and trapped, and we can't really travel to Europe anymore, if you want a little armchair vacation, hopefully the book will suffice for that. But the story starts with the discovery of a centuries-old medieval ship that's found buried half a mile underneath the ice of Greenland. The researchers go into the hold of the ship. They go into the ship's cabin. They discover a clockwork gold map that's ticking along that seems to be pointing towards the location of the mythic land of Tartarus, which is the Greek version of hell featured in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Some zealots learn of this. They believe they can use that knowledge to bring about an apocalypse, and it's up to Sigma Force to go in there and try to stop them. Of course, to do so, they have to cross through those gates of hell in order to save the world.
So one of the things that I really love when you come visit the store is you talk about how you kind of have this idea box that you just you come across something interesting and you just kind of put it in this little box that you think you're going to use later. So what were some of those little ideas that you kind of pulled from the box for this one?
Well, first of all, I should say I've upgraded. If I swing around here, you can see this these little line of steel filing things. That's my new idea box.
Very cool.
Now it's the new and improved version of the cardboard lawyer's box I used to use. It's just as disorganized, it's messy. I keep thinking I'm going to organize it into some type of, this is, all about, viruses. This is all about genetic engineering. This is all about, the history of so-and-so. But no, it's just, unfortunately, I read a bunch of stuff. I talk to a bunch of people, and I don't have the patience to cram it into its proper files. It just goes into a big messy thing. But for this book, it deals with Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. So again, I've always wanted to bring that pair of epics into a story. I just didn't know how. If you look at my other Sigma books, a common theme, though I hate to use that word from English Lit, is that I'm always looking for those buried truths, the true history behind mythology. You're looking for the seeds that became that story. And for the longest period of time, everybody thought Troy was a mythic place. For centuries, people always thought it was just something that Homer made up. It wasn't a real place until the late 19th century, when a armchair archaeologist happened to be digging along the coast of Turkey, uncovered some ruins. He believed it was Troy. It took a couple decades for archaeologists to actually confirm that it was indeed Troy. But when that happened, within just a moment, then mythology became history. And so that was in my idea box over here. But then more recently, just a couple of years ago, there was another armchair archaeologist. Again, I don't know what archaeologists are doing and why all these armchair archaeologists are uncovering these and revealing these surprising things. There was a gentleman named Robert Biddlestone. He was a British management consultant. So again, no history of being an archaeologist, but he was fascinated with Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And he decided to piece together clues in Homer's Odyssey and pairing it up with modern geological tools like Google Earth and some of the other things like that, trying to find a location that matched the description of Ithaca. Now, Ithaca is the hometown of Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey. It's where Odysseus ends up finally reaching at the end of that epic journey of his. But again, for the longest period of time, people thought Ithaca was a made-up place. There was an island called Ithaca. That's a real place in Greece, but it was named that after the book, not because it was based on the book. And the geology didn't match what was described in Homer's book. But again, Robert Biddlestone doggedly pursued, looked for clues, matched it up, discovered that the most likely match, and it was pretty precise, was a peninsula in Greece known as Paliki. And again, similar, it took a while for archaeologists and historians to sort of review his work and realize, yeah, you're right, that actually does match that particular, almost to a T. So all of a sudden now they're saying, yeah, that's probably where Ithaca was located. So, within a matter of a couple centuries, from early 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann discovered the ruins of Troy, to more modern times when Robert Biddlestone discovered Ithaca. So suddenly we had the starting place of the Odyssey, where when the Trojan War ends, Odysseus leaves Troy, and we have the end spot, Ithaca, where Odysseus finally reaches, and are now real places. They're not made up places, they're mythic places, not mythic places, they're real places. And so me as a thriller writer, I'm thinking, well, what about everything in between those two locations? The story of gods and monsters, of magic and witches, what else could be true? And at one point in that story, Odysseus does reach the gates of Tartarus, the gates of hell, has some conversation with some spirits there. So again, my goal then was to try to piece together how much more of Odysseus's story could actually be based on real places and real facts. That became sort of the jumping off point for building the story of the last Odyssey.
So what kind of research did you do to figure out what stuff was potentially real? Did you, like you said, you found this guy who had done a lot of it. What kind of research did you do on your own for it?
A lot of it was, and again, I don't travel that much for research, but this is one book that required me to do a lot more travel than I thought I would have to do. I went to museums in Athens and in Olympia. I went to Rome. I talked to historians, archaeologists, anybody that's willing to let me bend their ear. I went to the island of Sardinia and looked at some Neolithic ruins there. I went to the Spanish coast, where again was one of the places where they believed Tartarus was originally located. So again, just began piecing together this big story about what happened during the Greek Dark Ages. They're basically 3 centuries of time. I think it's from the 8th century, if I remember correctly, to the 11th century BC, where very little is known. The only really written record of the Greek Dark Ages is Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. That's why the Greek Dark Ages are sometimes referred to as the Homeric Ages. So why that area to me particularly was so fascinating is besides the fact it's a blank place in history, that's what I'm always looking for as a writer, is I'm looking for those historical mysteries, those pieces of history that end in a question mark, something I can probably, hopefully shine a light in and maybe get some further information about. And why there was so little known about that period of time is that there was a giant war that occurred across the breadth of the Mediterranean. It basically laid low 3 civilizations that were thriving. It knocked out the Mycenaean Greeks, the Anatolian Hittites, and the Egyptians. They were thriving. They were very successful on their sections of the Mediterranean. And all of a sudden, an opposing force came in and wiped them out, and then mysteriously vanished. Even to this day, there's a lot of debate among historians and archaeologists exactly what happened during that period of time. They're not quite sure who the enemy was. Now there are some theories, and that's what's explored in the last Odyssey, is who was this enemy that came from out of nowhere, wiped out 3 major civilizations, then vanished again. So I have again, that ties to the same time that Homer's Iliad, the Odyssey takes place, is that there be some overlap between that great war, which a little tale right across there. So again, I was wondering if, can I do what Biddlestone did and what Heinrich Schliemann did? Can I piece together clues in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, pair it up with these information from historians and archaeologists, and try to answer that question: who is that enemy?
I imagine that's got to make it a little bit easier too to do a period where there's potentially, I guess both easier and a little bit harder to do a period that kind of not much is written about, not much is known about, because if you're able to find stuff, you don't, or it's easier to kind of make up some stuff as well. Does that make it easier for you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for, blank places of history where I can fill in the blanks with my own imagination. But I'm also looking for, that bit of science that just makes me go, what if, where's that headed? So I can do some extrapolation. I usually try to not just pull it out of thin air. At the end of all of my novels, there's that what's true, what's not section, where I sort of explain where the information that you see in the book, where I got it from, and how much is based on fact, and how much is based on pure fiction. So if there's any topics that are raised in the novel, I'm going to leave my readers with some breadcrumbs to pick up and follow if they have any interest.
My coworker Rebecca, who's a huge fan of the series, she gave me a couple of questions, and one of her questions was, she loves all of the recurring characters that you have in the series. One of her favorites is Kowalski, and she wondered if you have any favorite recurring characters and why they're your favorite.
Again, it's almost like asking what your favorite kid is. I mean, different characters I like for different reasons. I mean, I love Monk, I love Cat, I love their relationship. I love, the femme fatale of Seishan, this, former assassin turned co-conspirator with a Sigma. Gray's the main character, and he's basically who I was sort of wish I could be. Though in all actuality, I'm more like Kowalski. He's not the brightest bulb of that crew, but I think he's got layers to him that people don't know about. And I recruited Kowalski out of one of my standalone novels. He was originally in Ice Hunt, which occurred, I think, like 4 or 5 books before the first Sigma book. But I liked that character, so I missed writing him. He was a fun character to write, a little bit of comic relief, so I recruited him to Sigma, even though it didn't necessarily belong in Sigma. And I've never really featured him in a major role as a point of view character. Usually he's just, he's along for the ride. Except that there was my book, The Bone Labyrinth, was the first time I featured Kowalski as a point of view character. And I did that because that book dealt with Neanderthals, which is a pretty good description of Kowalski. So I thought, if I'm going to write a book about Neanderthals, I'm going to write a book with, featuring Kowalski's point of view. And when I was preparing to write The Last Odyssey, I thought, well, I'm going to take Sigma Force, through the gates of hell. I really want to get Kowalski's point of view on when they go through there. So he's, again, this is the only second time where he appears as a point of view character in any of the Sigma novels.
So when you're working on the books, are you aware of how often you use the characters? And or do you think, well, if I use this one a lot in the last book and we haven't seen this other person for a while, it's time to catch up with them? Or do they just kind of appear when they're ready to be in the story?
They appear when they're ready to be. I mean, there's some times where, like, Monk will appear in 2 or 3 of the novels, and then he'll fade back in the background, and so it goes back and forth.
You mentioned this a little bit. You said that this new book has required a lot more kind of travel with the research. Has the way that you approach writing the books in the series differed a lot since, when you started with Sandstorm versus now this one so many books in?
Actually, no. I'm pretty regimented in my process. It goes back to when I was writing and working full-time as a veterinarian. I only had cracks in time in which to get my writing done during my veterinary day. So I had to structure a routine around that. And I think any writer has to eventually find that routine that's comfortable for them. And so initially, when I was writing full-time, working full-time rather, I made a commitment to write 3 pages a day. But then I had to qualify that a little bit. That, well, not 3 pages a day. I'll do 3 double-spaced pages a day, which is basically a page and a half. And I'm not going to do it every day. I'm going to do 5 out of 7 days of the week. So, but once I got that sort of down to that point, I realized I can fit this comfortably with my day job. And I thought, if I'm ever more productive, I will be much more. I'll be able to produce more output. And now that I write full time, I am a little bit more productive. But I do 5 double-spaced pages a day. I find I hit a wall about that period of time. So my typical day is, I do 5 new pages of writing a day. I do that 5 out of 7 days of the week. The other part of my day, it takes about an hour for me to write a page. So that's about 5 hours of new writing. The rest of my day is spent, researching, calling up people, getting information, getting details I need for my next writing day. My big research for a novel that has changed a little bit. I used to be a little bit loosey-goosey with the amount of big research I was allowed to do before I started a novel. And I ran into a little bit of a trap when I was writing Sandstorm, which is the first book in the Sigma universe. I was researching and researching and researching. And I realized I'm not actually writing anything. Eventually I realized, I'm more playing at that point. I'm thinking I'm working, but I'm not. So at that point, then I made a commitment to myself that I was allowed to do my big researches where I'm researching the history, the science, the locations. I could do that for 90 days. But on the 91st day, I've actually got to start putting words on paper. Now, that doesn't mean research stops. Every time you write, every single page requires you to double check something, or whether it's, how do you say so-and-so in Turkish, or where's the Starbucks in DuPont Circle. You're always trying to find out all those little details that you need to double check every single day. But that's typically my day. Then I just 5 pages a day as I go through the novel.
And do you find that you don't potentially have to do as much research on some things just because you potentially have done it for previous books? Does that make it a little bit easier too?
It does, definitely. I've got huge stacks of research. I've got drawers over here that are just, each drawer is like for one book. And so oftentimes I'll go, oh gosh, this is a little bit what I was handling before. I could just pull that drawer open and I have my research ready to go. But I have to be careful with that, because a lot of times, either, especially with science, the science changes very rapidly. So what I thought was, current back when I wrote that book 5 books ago is no longer appropriate for what I'm writing today. So I need to make sure that I've got to sort of freshen up that research, even if it's something I've tackled before. And the biggest danger is thinking that I know something that I don't. A lot of times I think, oh, well, I'm not going to, research this detail. I am going to just plug it in there. I remember it was, what book was that? This is embarrassing to admit because I'm a veterinarian. It was Seventh Plague. There's a horrible error in that book that I just want to do a face plant. I was talking about the arrangement of arteries around a heart, and those are the coronary arteries. Well, I just wasn't thinking, because I didn't bother. Oh, I know all the arteries, and so I put carotid, just because it began with the letter C, and I was going to hurry. And once it was there, it was like it becomes in cement. Every time I see it, I think, well, I know that information already, so I'm not going to look at it with a fine-tooth comb like I might other parts of the story. And so it went in print. So it's embarrassing that you think you know something, and that's where you usually fall on your face.
And you kind of mentioned this a little bit, just with technology changing so fast. How do you balance what you're going to put in the book? Are you aware that, like, if I put this in a book now, like when it comes out, potentially in the year, that it's not, do you just put it in anyway and don't worry about that? Or is that something you worry about?
Oh, no, I worry about it, and it terrorizes me. Again, even though I do a lot of research, I also describe myself as a bit of a lazy researcher. I would rather somebody tell me something than me necessarily have to look it up. So especially when it comes to fine detail from talking to a historian or talking to a scientist, but more so with the scientist, I need to speak to them in person versus reading what they wrote in a book, or because what the information they put in a book oftentimes is years old already. If even what's in maybe a journal article I was reading, even that's 3 or 4 months old. So I like to double check with the scientist that wrote that article. I'll call them up and say, hey, don't tell me what you wrote in that article. Tell me to turn around, look at what's on your work table right now. Tell me what's on your lab. What's going on right now? Because I need that immediacy. Because even when I'm writing a novel, that information, by the time that novel is in print, it's going to be about a year old. So I definitely, I'm not too embarrassed if, like, 10 books down the line, maybe the information has changed. Yeah. I think most people can take that in context, but I would really be embarrassed if, a book came out, especially the last book I wrote was Crucible, which is all about artificial intelligence. That I had to keep editing constantly because the information was changing so rapidly while I was writing the book. So I would have to keep, go back and changing, and just hoping that enough of it was current that it wouldn't make a total fool of myself when the book came out.
So what are you working on next?
Coming out in September, and hopefully, because I wasn't able to do a tour for this book, maybe they'll allow me to do a mini tour for this next book. It's an anthology. I don't think they were planning on touring me for the anthology. but maybe they will since I missed out on this tour. It's a collection of all the short fiction I've written over the past 20 years. It's most of them are a bit hard to find because they're either no longer in print or they're in e-zines that no longer exist. So we've collated them all into one volume. And I did new introductions to all the stories, and most of the stories at least, because I realized that span of stories spanned my career. And so I was using those stories as sort of a roadmap of how I became an author, how I matured as an author, why I told these stories and why I told them then, what I might change differently if I could write them again. But I didn't want to just sell old material. Included with this anthology is a brand new story. It's a novella. It's about a 100-page story featuring Tucker Wayne and his military war dog Kane. So they're going to have their own adventure, brand new adventure in Unrestricted Access, which is the name of the anthology, coming out in September. Just finishing up the next Sigma novel. It will be coming out next spring. It's called The Savage Zone. And oddly enough, it's all about viruses. When this whole situation arose, I was thinking, oh, well, wouldn't it be more appropriate that I had written The Savage Zone now and Last Odyssey next time? But now I'm thinking maybe not. I don't think people necessarily want to read all about viruses because my book is not a pandemic novel. It's more about the biology and evolution and how frightening viruses actually are. Their biology is really weird, and you're going to find out how weird they are and how ubiquitous they are. And even though it's not a pandemic novel, it's in many regards it's even scarier. So that's coming up next spring. On top of that, I'm also working on a brand new first book in a fantasy.
Ooh.
So that's called The Starlet's Crown. It'll be published by Tor. So that's coming out in the summer of 2021.
Very cool. So because you've done some fantasy stuff in the past, the short fiction anthology that's coming out, is it all going to be kind of more kind of stuff like you're doing now, or does it kind of jump back and forth genre wise?
There is some fantasy stories in the story. I wrote a young adult urban fantasy for an anthology done by R.L. Stein. So that story appears in the anthology.
Very cool. And I know there are definitely some people that'll be excited to see that Tucker Wayne will make another appearance in that. So that's really cool. So
into them. I mean, I miss writing them. It's been a while since the last Tucker Wayne novel came out. So it was fun going back and putting myself back into the four paws of that dog and writing scenes from the dog's point of view.
And how is it being able to write kind of in the fantasy world again after not having done it for a while?
It's at the beginning of my career, I was doing one thriller and one fantasy every year for the first almost decade of my career. So it's fun going back. I always when I was writing both, people would say, "Well, what do you like writing better?" And I always tell people it's whatever I'm not working on now is what I like writing better, because when you're writing a thriller, you realize all the inconveniences of and the difficulties of writing a thriller. You can't wave a magic wand and get out of trouble. It's gotta make sense. Whereas when I'm writing a fantasy novel, it's times like, oh, I really need a car or I really need a telephone because this group of characters don't need this information or this other group of characters. So each has their own challenges. They're why I liked writing those two different genres simultaneously. Well, it wasn't some of those alternating. Was thrillers are sort of staccato paced. They're their own pros and cons of writing that thriller. And then jumping to fantasy, it's a little slower pace, your world building. So it's a very different process. So it's fun, stretching your literary legs that way. So it was fun returning to that.
So guys that are watching out there, we've got a couple more minutes before we turn in. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, just post them on the Facebook page. I'm keeping an eye on them. Somebody asked what kind of dog that was wandering by. It's a cat. I've got two of them and they are very interested in what's going on over here.
Yeah, I got my two dogs, but they're knocked out. I fed them before this started. Guaranteed to knock them out at least for 45 minutes, so they don't hassle me nonstop.
So one of the things, I don't see any questions popping up yet, but one of the things I was talking with Matthew Quirk about is, I've seen a lot of writers say that a lot of this kind of shelter at home stuff doesn't feel radically different for them because, you're kind of always at home anyway, writing. So has this been an adjustment for you being kind of at home, or are you sort of like, this is kind of normal life?
Again, I think all authors are natural hermits. We live in our own heads and we live in our own world. So this is fairly comfortable. It's more challenging that this was supposed to be my book tour.
Yeah.
So, everything was, my book came out just as things were falling apart. So, all the way until a week before my book tour was supposed to launch, there was still talk of me going on my book tour.
Yeah.
First, I was supposed to appear at Tucson Book Festival, that canceled. Then I was supposed to do a keynote at WonderCon, that canceled. Then different stores began to cancel. Then the libraries began to cancel. Mm-hmm. So it was a dynamic, challenging way of trying to shift gears, in midstream, literally, is that, all geared up, we had our tour all lined up and all of a sudden everything's falling apart. And now you're trying to scramble and do things digitally. You're trying to think, well, I want to leave a trail of signed copies across the US, but how can I manage that when I'm sequestered at the house? So it's taken a little bit of, so that's all new. That's been challenging.
So Mahir has asked, how is the Godslayer Chronicles writing going?
Of course you're asking that, Mahir. So Mahir runs the fantasy fiction website, and he's a good friend of mine. I've known him since, I think, my first book. We've learned communication. And so the Godslayer, for those that don't know, that was written under my pen name, James Clemens. The first two of a 5-book series were published, and then they were no longer published. So I've gone ahead and I've written the third book in the Godslayer series that is sitting right over there. And I'm still plugging away at book number 4. I probably get book number 4 done, I'm hoping by end of next month. And then I'm going to write the 5th book in between things. And then once all the whole series is done, then we're just going to release them one after the other.
Are you going to reuse the pseudonym for the fantasy stuff with Tor, or is it coming out as James Rollins?
No, it's just back when I first started, I was discovered as a writer almost within a week. Mm-hmm. Of James Rollins, the fantasy writer, the thriller writer, and James Clemens, the fantasy writer. I was unpublished, and all of a sudden I had worked on a thriller, Subterranean. I was shopping, I was getting a lot of rejections. While I was doing that, I wrote a fantasy. And then by the time I was finished that, all of a sudden they both sold. And to do 2 different houses, and both said, hey, since you're going to be starting out and you have no track record, why don't you pick different pen names for each genre? And so Clemens and Rollins were born. But now it's a poorly kept secret that Clemens is Rollins. It seems really disingenuous to pretend that, that I'm not.
Well, I think people are a lot more willing. Yeah, and I think people now are a lot more willing to kind of cross genres and take chances on other stuff, especially if they see like, oh, it's James Rollins and he's doing something else. I think people now are a little bit more willing to take chances on things that aren't maybe necessarily in their like normal writing wheelhouse or reading wheelhouse.
And I've done that through most of my career. I've always done like one thriller and then something else. For the first decade, it was a fantasy as the other book.
Yeah.
Eventually it became other standalones alongside the main thriller. Then it was, trying to do some co-written projects. Like we did a sort of almost in a horror genre with Rebecca Cantrell, the Sanguinus series. So I've always, that's what I always tell writers when I'm ever teaching a writing class or a seminar, you should write what you love to read. You should be writing from a point of passion. If you're not writing what you enjoy to read, readers have a really good nose on them. They can sense when you don't really know this genre, or you're, I'm not feeling that passion behind the writing. They can sense that. So, I grew up, and again, I had another conversation. So I pulled a bunch of books. So I'll share this with you just while I have a few minutes. My Sigmund was born basically from these Doc Savage pulp novels from the 30s and 40s that were reprinted as Bantam paperbacks in the 70s. And I read these Bantam paperbacks. It's 181 of them. They're a team of sort of scientists and intellectuals that protect the world against various threats. basically Sigma's a modern spin on this. While growing up, I loved, Stephen King. Here's my copy of that. I loved vampire novels. Song of Cali, it's a horror writer novel. I had this book, Michael Crichton, on my desk when I was writing my first book, Subterranean, because I didn't know how to write a novel. So I used this as my template. Thought, when does, Michael Crichton introduce a dinosaur? Well, that's when I introduce a monster in my book. When does, he kill off the first character? That's when one of my characters are going to die. So I use that as a template. But, it wasn't just that. I loved spy novels. Big influence of mine, Poorly Kept Secret, is Clive Cussler, avid reader. I just loved all of his adventures. And if anything, this is, again, a big influence, a cross between the pulp novels of the 30s and Clive Cussler with a little bit of Michael Crichton in there. Neil Gaiman, this is, Neil Gaiman gets a lot of credit for American Gods, but this is one of my favorite books of his. It's a very short book, Neverwhere. It's based on a radio teleplay. I won't bore you. I got a ton of books over there I was going to pull up. But so I grew up reading a bunch of different genres. So when it came to writing, I wasn't quite sure what to write because I liked all these different genres. So I just decided, well, I'm going to write, this sort of what I thought was science fiction, Subterranean, because it had telepathic marsupial creatures that live underneath Antarctica. So I thought it was fantasy. I thought it was science fiction. But my editor corrected me and said, no, this takes place in the present days, therefore it's a thriller. And wasn't having any success selling that. I thought, well, maybe I'm not a thriller writer. I will jump to one of the other genres I love to read. So I wrote my first fantasy. So again, I just like writing what I like to read. So it has a tendency to have me shifting a little bit of shifting gears every now and again.
And that's cool because kind of based on everything that you just held up, you could definitely see kind of all of that. Kind of you threw all of that in a blender and it becomes these books. And that's kind of the stuff that I like to read too. Where like you said, where it plays with the genre and it bends it. And like you said, you can definitely tell when writers are writing kind of something that they're passionate about. So I am not seeing any other questions popping up here. So I think we are about done. Before we head out, remind everybody we've been talking about the newest book, The Last Odyssey. If you order copies from Murder by the Book, we don't have signed copies, but Jim was really great to send us a bunch of signed book plates. So we've got these to go with the books. And then we also still have some of the, sorry, let me backwards because of the camera, but The Last Odyssey compasses. So if you order your book, we've got those. We are close to the public, but we're still processing mail and phone orders. So you can order through the website. You can give the store a call. And if you do give us a call, we're there Monday through Saturday from 11 to 3. So James, thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll get to see you in the fall, and take care, and we will chat soon.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
You too.